On February 20, 1942, Japanese naval commanders in Rabaul studied their reconnaissance reports and saw an opportunity that could end American resistance in the Pacific. A lone American aircraft carrier had been spotted approximately 450 miles northeast of their base. The United States Pacific Fleet already lay crippled after Pearl Harbor. Only 2 fleet carriers remained operational in the entire Pacific Ocean. If Japan could sink just one more, American offensive capability would collapse entirely. The Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched 17 twin-engine bombers to finish what Pearl Harbor had started. Approximately 450 miles away, aboard the USS Lexington, a 27-year-old lieutenant named Edward O'Hare was about to face those bombers alone. His wingman's guns had jammed. Most of the squadron was scattered across the sky, chasing the first wave of attackers. O'Hare had 4 machine guns, enough ammunition for roughly 34 seconds of continuous firing, and approximately 4 minutes to save his ship and everyone aboard her. The Japanese believed the Americans were already beaten. O'Hare was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. The miscalculation that sent those bombers toward Lexington began 10 weeks earlier on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. December 7, 1941 had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Japanese aircraft had sunk or damaged 18 American warships and destroyed nearly 200 aircraft at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's battleship force, the backbone of American naval power since the turn of the century, ceased to exist in a single morning. The attack seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions about American weakness. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor, knowing that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial might. His strategy depended on delivering such a devastating opening blow that America would negotiate peace rather than endure years of costly fighting. The smoking ruins of Battleship Row appeared to validate this approach. American morale would collapse. American resolve would crumble. The soft democracy would sue for terms, but the Japanese had missed their most important targets. America's aircraft carriers had been absent from Pearl Harbor that day. Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was near Midway on a similar mission. Saratoga had just entered San Diego after maintenance on the West Coast. These 3 ships represented America's entire offensive capability in the Pacific. Japanese strategists understood that destroying them would end American resistance for years, perhaps permanently. The situation deteriorated further in January 1942. On the 11th of that month, Japanese Submarine 06 torpedoed Saratoga approximately 500 miles southwest of Oahu. The torpedo struck near the portside fire room, killing 6 sailors and flooding 3 boiler rooms. Saratoga limped to Puget Sound for repairs that would last 5 months. This left only Enterprise and Lexington to challenge Japan's triumphant fleet, which was simultaneously capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. Admiral Ernest King, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, recognized the desperate mathematics. America possessed exactly 2 operational fleet carriers to defend an ocean spanning nearly 64 million square miles. Japan had 10 carriers, including 6 that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The numerical disadvantage was crippling. But King understood something the Japanese did not. The American public was not seeking peace. They were demanding revenge. The carriers had to survive long enough for American shipyards to build the fleet that would eventually overwhelm Japan. King's strategy required calculated risks. The carriers could not hide in port while Japan consolidated its conquests. They had to strike back, demonstrate American resolve, and keep the Japanese off balance. but they could not be risked recklessly. Losing either carrier would be catastrophic. King needed aggressive commanders who understood the balance between audacity and survival. Vice Admiral Wilson Brown commanded Task Force 11, built around Lexington. His orders sent him into enemy-controlled waters to strike the Japanese base at Rabaul on the northeastern tip of New Britain. The newly captured port was being transformed into Japan's most powerful stronghold in the South Pacific. Engineers were expanding airfields. Troops were pouring in. The harbour was filling with warships. Rabaul threatened to become an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which Japan could dominate the entire region. Brown's mission was audacious, bordering on reckless. He would sail a carrier representing half of America's Pacific aviation capability directly toward enemy airfields filled with land-based bombers. The Japanese had hundreds of aircraft within range of his approach route. If they caught Lexington in open water, the concentrated power of land-based aviation could overwhelm the carrier's defenses. Captain Frederick Sherman, Lexington's commanding officer, understood the risks. So did every pilot and sailor aboard. They sailed anyway. The man who would prevent catastrophe on February 20th came from an unlikely background that few aboard Lexington knew anything about. Edward Henry O'Hare was born March 13, 1914, in St. Louis, Missouri. His father, Edward Joseph O'Hare, was a lawyer who had become a business partner of the most notorious criminal in America. The elder O'Hare, known as Easy Eddie, had met Al Capone through dog racing. He held patents on a mechanical rabbit used to lead greyhounds around tracks, and Capone saw profitable possibilities in the technology. The two men became partners, operating the Hawthorne Kennel Club dog track in Cicero, Illinois. Easy Eddie managed Sportsman's Park Racetrack. He provided legal counsel for Capone's various enterprises. He moved in circles where legitimate business and organized crime intersected seamlessly, and he grew wealthy doing so. But in 1930, something changed. Edward Joseph O'Hare became an informant for the Internal Revenue Service. He provided critical evidence about Capone's financial operations, evidence that helped federal prosecutors convict the gangster of tax evasion in October 1931. The information Easy Eddie supplied proved essential to the case that sent Capone to prison. Why a successful businessman embedded in the Chicago underworld would risk everything to betray one of the most dangerous criminals in America remains debated among historians. Some believe he wanted to ensure his son could attend the Naval Academy without the taint of mob association. Others suggest he genuinely regretted his criminal connections. Whatever his motivation, the decision proved fatal. On November 8, 1939, as young Butch O'Hare was completing flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, his father was driving on Ogden Avenue in Chicago. A car pulled alongside his vehicle near the intersection with Rockwell Street. Shotgun blasts tore through the window. Easy Eddie O'Hare died at the scene. The murder occurred 8 days before Al Capone's scheduled release from Alcatraz on November 16th. The case was never solved, though the timing suggested obvious suspects. The younger O'Hare had chosen a different path entirely. He attended Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, from 1927 to 1932. There he became an expert marksman and president of the Rifle Club. The marksmanship skills he developed with rifles would translate directly to aerial gunnery. The discipline he learned at military school shaped his approach to naval training. He initially failed the Naval Academy entrance examination, but refused to accept defeat. He passed on his second attempt and entered Annapolis with the class of 1937. His academic performance was unremarkable. He graduated on June 3, 1937, ranking 255th out of 323 midshipmen. Nothing in his academy record suggested future greatness. He was a competent student, a decent athlete, and a popular classmate, but he showed no particular distinction that would predict what he would accomplish 5 years later. After graduation, O'Hare served 2 years aboard the battleship New Mexico, learning the fundamentals of naval operations. Battleship duty was considered prestigious, the traditional path to command for ambitious officers, but O'Hare was drawn to aviation. In June 1939, he reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola for flight training. Pensacola separated natural pilots from those who merely learned to fly. The training was demanding, the washout rate high. O'Hare discovered that he possessed exceptional aptitude for aerial combat. He earned his naval aviator wings on May 2, 1940, and received orders to Fighting Squadron 3, known as VF-3. This assignment would shape everything that followed. VF-3 was not an ordinary fighter squadron. It was commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Thach, one of the most innovative tactical thinkers in naval aviation. Thach had been studying reports about the Japanese Zero fighter, and what he learned disturbed him deeply. The Zero outperformed every American fighter in speed, climb rate, maneuverability, and range. American pilots flying F-4F Wildcats would face an opponent that could outfly them in virtually every category. Standard tactics would get them killed. Thach developed a training program that bordered on brutal. He led what pilots called the humiliation team, a group of experienced aviators who systematically defeated new pilots in mock combat. The purpose was not cruelty, but education. Pilots had to understand their weaknesses before they could overcome them. Most newcomers were dismantled repeatedly before they began improving. The process was humbling, often frustrating, but it produced aviators who understood the realities of aerial combat. O'Hare was different. Thach later recalled that the first time he took the young pilot up and gave him altitude advantage, O'Hare made no mistakes. Thach did everything he could to fool him and shake him. He tried every trick in his considerable repertoire. Nothing worked. O'Hare tracked him through maneuvers that lost other pilots. He anticipated moves before Thach made them. He possessed what Thach described as a sense of timing and relative motion that he may have been born with. This was the intangible quality that separated extraordinary pilots from merely competent ones. Flight training could teach procedures and techniques. Experience could refine judgment, but the instinctive ability to track a moving target in three-dimensional space, to calculate closure rates and deflection angles without conscious thought, to know where an enemy aircraft would be rather than where it was, these gifts could not be taught. O'Hare had them naturally. The two men developed a partnership that would influence American fighter tactics for the rest of the war. Thach was working on a defensive maneuver to counter the Zero's advantages. He knew American pilots could not outmaneuver Japanese fighters in traditional dogfights. They needed tactics that used Wildcat strengths, particularly its rugged construction and heavy armament, while negating Japanese advantages in agility. He conceived a crisscrossing defensive pattern where two fighters would weave toward each other, forcing any pursuing enemy to face the guns of the partner aircraft. Thach needed a skilled wingman to test his theories. He chose O'Hare. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, they practiced what would become known as the Thach Weave. O'Hare led a section flying at full power to simulate American performance, while Thach's section flew at reduced power to approximate the Zero's superior maneuverability. They refined the timing of the weave, the distances between aircraft, the angles of the crossing turns. O'Hare proved the perfect partner for this work, executing the maneuvers with precision while suggesting refinements that improved the tactic's effectiveness. The Thach weave would save countless American lives once war began. It was first used in combat at the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, where it helped VF-3 pilots survive encounters with Zeros that should have been fatal. The tactic spread throughout the Pacific Fleet and became standard doctrine. O'Hare's contribution to its development, though overshadowed by his later heroics, was substantial. He was not merely practicing a maneuver, he was helping create the tactical framework that American fighter pilots would use to defeat the Japanese. When war came in December 1941, VF-3 was stationed aboard Saratoga. The torpedo that crippled that carrier in January forced the squadron to transfer to Lexington. O'Hare found himself aboard one of only 2 operational American carriers in the Pacific, sailing toward a confrontation that would test everything Thach had taught him. The voyage toward Rabaul was tense. Every sailor aboard Lexington understood the stakes. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were searching for them constantly. Land-based bombers at multiple airfields could reach them within hours of detection. The task force maintained radio silence and changed course frequently, trying to approach the target undetected. February 20th began with the kind of discovery that carrier commanders dreaded most. At 10:15 in the morning, Lexington's radar operators detected an unidentified aircraft bearing 180 degrees at 35 miles. A Kawanishi H-6K flying boat, known to the Allies as the Mavis, was shadowing the task force. The large patrol bomber had spotted them. Wildcats scrambled to intercept. Lieutenant Commander Thach himself led the pursuit, accompanied by Ensign Edward Selstrom. They caught the flying boat and shot it down at 11:12 in the morning, but the damage was already done. The Mavis crew had radioed Lexington's position to Rabaul before dying. Japanese commanders now knew exactly where to find the American carrier. The element of surprise was gone. Every bomber within range would soon be heading toward Task Force 11. Admiral Brown faced a difficult decision. He could abandon the mission and withdraw beyond range of Japanese aircraft, preserving his carrier but accomplishing nothing. Or he could press toward Rabaul, knowing that Japanese bombers were coming and hoping his fighters could stop them. Brown chose to continue. Lexington would not flee from a fight. At Vunakanow Airfield, near Rabaul, the 4th Kokutai received the contact report and began preparing a strike. The unit had recently arrived from Japan with 17 operational Mitsubishi G-4M bombers. These were the aircraft Americans called the Betty, twin-engine medium bombers designed for the long ranges of Pacific warfare. The G-4M was a remarkable aircraft in many ways. It possessed a range exceeding 2,300 miles when carrying bombs or torpedoes, allowing it to strike targets far beyond the reach of comparable aircraft. Its maximum speed exceeded 270 miles per hour. It carried a powerful armament of defensive machine guns and a 20mm tail cannon. Japanese naval aviators considered it an excellent weapons platform. But the Betty harbored a fatal flaw that February 20th would expose to devastating effect. Japanese designers had prioritized range and performance over survivability. To achieve its extraordinary range, the aircraft used wing integral fuel tanks that lacked self-sealing protection. The wings essentially formed part of the fuel system, maximizing capacity but creating enormous vulnerability. The aircraft carried minimal armor to protect crew members. A single well-placed burst from American fighters could ignite the fuel-laden wings, transforming the Betty into a fireball. Japanese crews knew this vulnerability intimately. They called their aircraft the one-shot lighter and the flying cigar. American pilots would learn to exploit this weakness ruthlessly. On February 20th, the consequences of Japanese design priorities would be demonstrated with terrible clarity. Lieutenant Commander Takuzo Ito, commander of the 4th Kokutai, organized his 17 bombers into 2 waves. The first wave of 9 aircraft flew under Lieutenant Masayoshi Nakagawa. Ito himself led the second wave of 8 bombers. They departed Rabaul in early afternoon, climbing toward the plotted position of the American carrier. Ito faced his own constraints. The Zero fighters at Rabaul lacked the range to escort his bombers to the target. External drop tanks had not yet arrived at the newly captured base. Without fighter protection, his bombers would face American Wildcats alone. Additionally, aerial torpedoes had not reached Rabaul yet, so his aircraft carried conventional bombs, rather than the ship-killing weapons that could sink a carrier with a single hit. These limitations should have counseled caution. Sending unescorted bombers against a defended carrier was inherently dangerous. Bombing from altitude was far less accurate than torpedo attack, reducing the probability of crippling hits. The prudent decision would have been to wait for proper resources before attacking, but the Japanese were riding a wave of victories that encouraged risk-taking. They had destroyed the American battle fleet at Pearl Harbor. They were conquering the Philippines. Singapore would fall in just 5 days. Everywhere Japanese forces attacked, they won. Why should this attack be different? American defenses were weak. American morale was shattered. The carrier would be easy prey. This confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. Lexington's radar detected the first wave of incoming bombers at 3:42 in the afternoon. The contacts appeared at a range that gave the defenders time to respond. Thach led 6 Wildcats toward the intercept point, with additional fighters following. Captain Sherman ordered the ship to increase speed and begin evasive maneuvers. The American fighters met Nakagawa's formation before it reached attack position. The engagement was brutally one-sided. Wildcats tore into the bomber formation from multiple angles, their 50 caliber machine guns shredding the unarmored aircraft. Betty after Betty burst into flames and fell toward the sea. The G4M's vaunted defensive armament proved inadequate against determined fighter attack. 5 bombers went down before reaching weapons release range. Lieutenant Nakagawa's aircraft survived the initial onslaught but sustained heavy damage. Rather than break off the attack, Nakagawa attempted to crash his crippled bomber into Lexington's flight deck. The suicide dive failed. Anti-aircraft fire from the ship's guns tore into his aircraft just yards from success. The bomber crashed into the sea approximately 75 yards astern of the carrier, close enough that crewmen on the fantail felt the spray. Of the 9 bombers in the first wave, none reached effective attack position, none dropped bombs accurately. All 9 aircraft were destroyed. The first Japanese assault had been annihilated, but the second wave was already approaching from a different direction. At 4:49 in the afternoon, Lexington's radar operators detected 8 more aircraft at 12 miles. Most of the ship's fighters were scattered across the sky, pursuing survivors of the first wave or returning to refuel. The task of intercepting this new threat fell to whoever could reach the bombers in time. Only 2 Wildcats were in position. Lieutenant Edward O'Hare and his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marion William Dufillo, had been held back as combat air patrol reserve over the carrier. They were the last line of defense. Thach vectored them toward the incoming bombers by radio. O'Hare pushed his throttle forward and turned to intercept. Dufilho followed in the proper wingman position. The 2 pilots could see the second wave now, 8 bombers flying in formation toward Lexington. The range closed rapidly. As they closed on the enemy formation, Dufilho attempted to charge his guns for the attack. The action that should have armed his 450 caliber machine guns produced nothing. He tried again. All 4 weapons remained inoperative. Some malfunction, perhaps a problem with the charging system or ammunition feed, had disabled his entire armament. He gestured to O'Hare, signaling the problem. Without functioning weapons, Dufilo was useless for the intercept. Standard procedure dictated that both pilots return to the carrier. A single fighter against 8 bombers was not a tactical equation with favorable odds. The bombers carried multiple defensive guns. They would concentrate their fire on any attacker. One Wildcat could not possibly stop them all. O'Hare ignored standard procedure. He gestured for Dufilo to stay with him and turned toward the enemy formation. He would make the attack alone. Dufilo refused to abandon his flight leader even though he could not fight. He remained in the area as a decoy, making passes at the bombers to draw defensive fire away from O'Hare. His willingness to face enemy guns without the ability to shoot back was an act of extraordinary courage that has been largely overlooked by history. But the burden of actually stopping 8 bombers fell entirely on one pilot with 4 guns and approximately 1,800 rounds of ammunition. O'Hare arrived above the Japanese formation with an altitude advantage, exactly as Thach had trained him. He positioned for high-side diving attacks, the technique that gave a single fighter the best chance against multiple bombers. This approach allowed him to use deflection shooting, firing ahead of the target and letting the bomber fly into his bullets while minimizing his exposure to concentrated defensive fire. The Betty bombers bristled with weapons. Each aircraft carried a 20mm tail cannon and 4 7.7mm machine guns in nose, dorsal, and waist positions. Flying straight into the formation would expose O'Hare to crossfire from multiple aircraft. The high-side attack let him engage individual bombers while passing through the formation too quickly for effective defense. What happened next lasted approximately 4 minutes. Those 4 minutes would define Edward O'Hare's legacy, save his carrier, and provide a desperate nation with the hero it needed. O'Hare began his first diving attack against the right side of the Japanese formation. He selected the trailing bomber, knowing that attacking from the rear would give defensive gunners the hardest tracking solution. His Wildcat screamed downward, 50 caliber tracers reaching toward the Betty's starboard engine. The bullets struck home. The engine tore free of its mountings in a shower of debris. The bomber veered out of formation, streaming smoke and flame. Without pausing to confirm the kill, O'Hare shifted his aim to the adjacent aircraft. A brief burst ignited the port engine. Another Betty fell away from the formation, trailing fire. O'Hare pulled up and circled to the opposite side of the bomber formation. He had to attack from different angles to prevent the defensive gunners from establishing a tracking pattern. His next dive targeted another bomber's engine. More hits, more flames. The third Betty dropped away, its crew jettisoning bombs into the empty ocean in a desperate attempt to stay airborne. The formation was disintegrating. Bombers that had flown in disciplined order now scattered as pilots tried to evade the single fighter that seemed to be everywhere at once. O'Hare pressed his attacks relentlessly. He maneuvered to point-blank range against one bomber and fired into the cockpit. The aircraft nosed over and plunged directly into the sea. Thach, racing toward the battle with reinforcements, arrived in time to witness 3 bombers falling in flames simultaneously. The sight astonished him. He had trained O'Hare. He knew the young pilot was exceptional, but this was beyond anything he had anticipated. Thach would later analyze O'Hare's ammunition expenditure and calculate that he had used approximately 60 rounds per bomber destroyed. The typical expenditure for aerial kills was 200 to 300 rounds. O'Hare's marksmanship was extraordinary even by the standards of exceptional pilots. Every burst found its target. Every target burned. Lieutenant Commander Ito's command aircraft had survived O'Hare's initial passes, but sustained severe damage. The port engine had been torn away entirely. The bomber could barely maintain altitude. Rather than attempt to escape, Ito chose to make his death meaningful. He aimed his crippled aircraft at Lexington and began his final dive. The suicide attack failed. Whether Ito lost control of his damaged aircraft or anti-aircraft fire finished what O'Hare started, the bomber missed the carrier and crashed into the sea. The commanding officer of the 4th Kokutai died within sight of the target he had been unable to hit. O'Hare made one final attack run against the remaining bombers. He pressed the trigger and his guns fell silent after 10 rounds. He had exhausted his ammunition. The engagement was over. Of the 8 bombers in the second wave, none reached effective attack position. Combined with the first wave, the Japanese had lost 15 of 17 aircraft. Only 2 badly damaged Bettys managed to struggle back to Rabaul, landing at Vunakanow at 7:50 that evening. Approximately 130 Japanese airmen died. No bombs struck Lexington. The nearest explosion landed approximately 100 feet astern of the carrier. The exact number of bombers O'Hare personally destroyed became a matter of historical debate that persists to this day. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, O'Hare claimed 6 kills. Captain Sherman, reviewing the evidence, credited him with 5 confirmed and 1 severely damaged. The Medal of Honor citation would adopt this figure. But post-war research told a more complicated story. Naval historian John Lundstrom spent years examining both American records and captured Japanese war documents from the 4th Kokutai. His 1997 biography of O'Hare, co-authored with Steve Ewing and titled Fateful Rendezvous, concluded that O'Hare actually shot down 3 bombers and heavily damaged 3 others. Some aircraft that observers saw trailing smoke and assumed destroyed actually survived long enough to crash elsewhere or limp back to base. The distinction matters for historical accuracy, but not for understanding what O'Hare accomplished. Whether he destroyed 3 bombers or 5, he had single-handedly broken a coordinated attack on one of America's 2 remaining Pacific carriers. Without his intervention, those bombers would have reached attack position and released their weapons against Lexington. Some bombs would have hit. The carrier might have been damaged or sunk. The consequences for American strategy in the Pacific would have been catastrophic. O'Hare returned to Lexington with minor damage. A single enemy bullet had penetrated his right wing. Some shell fragments from friendly anti-aircraft fire had scarred the fuselage. A nervous gunner on Lexington's catwalk had opened fire as O'Hare approached to land with his wheels down, the universal signal of friendly intent. O'Hare later found the embarrassed sailor and addressed him directly. He said that if the gunner did not stop shooting at him when he had his wheels down, he was going to have to report him to the gunnery officer. The young pilot who had just saved the ship from destruction delivered the rebuke with a grin. The gunner, who fully expected to be court-martialed, instead received a lesson in grace under pressure. News of O'Hare's action reached a nation desperate for heroes. Pearl Harbor had been a catastrophe that shattered American confidence. Wake Island had fallen after a heroic but doomed defense on December 23rd. The Philippines were collapsing under Japanese assault, with General Douglas MacArthur evacuating to Australia. Bataan would surrender in April, condemning thousands of American prisoners to the horrors of the Death March. Singapore, supposedly impregnable, fell to Japanese forces on February 15th, just 5 days before O'Hare's battle. Java fell on March 8th. Everywhere Americans looked, they saw defeat. The public needed evidence that Americans could fight back. They needed proof that Japanese victories were not inevitable. They needed heroes who demonstrated that individual courage could overcome overwhelming odds. O'Hare provided exactly what the nation required. His action was perfect for propaganda purposes without requiring any exaggeration. One pilot against impossible odds, a carrier saved, Japanese bombers falling in flames, The story captured public imagination in ways that complex naval operations could not. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the young lieutenant from St. Louis who had single-handedly defeated a Japanese air attack. On April 21, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt received O'Hare in the Oval Office of the White House. It was Roosevelt's first opportunity to decorate a war hero from World War II. The president read the Medal of Honor citation with all the rhetorical flourish for which he was famous. He described O'Hare's action as one of the most daring, if not the most daring, single action in the history of combat aviation. Roosevelt then invited O'Hare's wife, Rita, to place the medal around her husband's neck. The president remarked that if Rita was more skilled with her fingers than he was, she should do it. The gesture made for powerful photographs that appeared in newspapers from coast to coast. Here was proof that American fighting spirit had not been destroyed at Pearl Harbor. Here was a young naval officer who had faced down the enemy alone and emerged victorious. O'Hare became the first Navy aviator to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. He was promoted to lieutenant commander, jumping 2 ranks by presidential order. The promotion recognized not just his combat achievement, but his value as a symbol. America needed heroes, and O'Hare fit the role perfectly. Against his personal preferences, O'Hare was ordered stateside for a war bond tour. The Navy recognized his propaganda value and decided he could serve the war effort better by selling bonds than by flying combat missions. He visited the Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York, where workers who built Wildcats could meet a pilot who had used their aircraft to devastating effect. He paraded through St. Louis before tens of thousands of spectators who lined the streets to cheer their hometown hero. He gave speeches and posed for photographs and endured the publicity that he found deeply uncomfortable. The war bond tour served its purpose. Americans bought bonds with O'Hare's face on the promotional materials. Factory workers labored harder knowing that pilots like O'Hare depended on them. The hero from February 20th became a recruiting tool, a morale booster, and a symbol of defiance against Japan. But the publicity tour had an unintended consequence. It kept O'Hare away from the battles that would determine the war's course. He missed the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, where Lexington was finally sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers, but the Japanese advance on Port Moresby was stopped in the first carrier battle where opposing ships never sighted each other. He missed the Battle of Midway in June, where American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese flat-tops and permanently reversed the tide of the Pacific War in what historians consider the turning point of the conflict. The hero who had saved Lexington was not present when she went down. He was not present for the decisive victory that vindicated everything he had fought for. On June 19, 1942, O'Hare finally escaped the publicity circuit and assumed command of VF-3, relieving his mentor John Thach. He was determined to return to combat. He was equally determined to find new ways to fight more effectively. Japanese bombers had begun attacking American carriers at night, approaching in darkness when fighters could not intercept them. Radar could detect the incoming aircraft, but fighters had no way to find their targets in the blackness of Pacific nights. The Japanese exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. Night attacks allowed them to strike American task forces without facing the fighter opposition that devastated daylight raids. O'Hare proposed a solution that no one had attempted before. He developed what he called Black Panther operations, the first carrier-based night fighter tactics in American naval history. The concept was ingenious. Radar-equipped TBF Avenger torpedo bombers would detect incoming Japanese aircraft and lead F-6F Hellcat fighters to the target. The Avengers would illuminate the enemy with searchlights, while the Hellcats attacked. The combination of radar direction and visual identification would allow night intercepts that were previously impossible. The tactics were experimental and extraordinarily dangerous. Flying from carriers at night was challenging under any circumstances. The deck looked like a small rectangle of light in infinite darkness. Depth perception vanished. Vertigo threatened constantly. Pilots who flew night operations accepted risks that day flyers never faced. Adding combat to night carrier operations multiplied the dangers exponentially. Coordinating multiple aircraft in darkness required skills that did not exist in any training manual. Distinguishing friendly aircraft from enemy in the chaos of night battle was nearly impossible. The potential for fatal mistakes was enormous. O'Hare insisted on leading the missions himself. He would not ask his pilots to take risks he was unwilling to share. This was characteristic of his leadership style. He led from the front always. He took the most dangerous assignments. He expected much from his men, but expected more from himself. On November 26, 1943, O'Hare led the second Black Panther mission during Operation Galvanic, the American invasion of the Gilbert Islands. His task force was operating near Tarawa Atoll, where Marines were fighting one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Japanese bombers had been striking the fleet at night, and O'Hare's experimental tactics offered the only way to stop them. That evening, radar detected incoming Japanese aircraft. O'Hare launched from the carrier Enterprise with his wingman, Ensign Warren Andrew Scone, following a TBF Avenger piloted by Lieutenant Commander John Phillips, commander of Torpedo Squadron 6. The three aircraft climbed into darkness, heading toward the approaching enemy. The mission went wrong almost immediately. Phillips's Avenger detected multiple contacts on radar. Japanese bombers were in the area, but so were other American aircraft returning from various missions. In the confusion of night operations, identifying friend from foe became nearly impossible. A lone G-4M Betty bomber apparently joined the American formation, attracted by recognition lights that were supposed to help friendly aircraft identify each other. The same lights that prevented Americans from shooting each other also drew the enemy close. What happened next remains disputed despite decades of investigation. The Avenger's turret gunner, aviation ordnance man First Class Alvin Kernan, fired at an aircraft crossing behind the TBF. Moments later, he clearly saw traces from what he identified as the Betty bomber striking O'Hare's Hellcat from behind. Ensign Scone reported that O'Hare slid out of formation and disappeared from sight. Radio calls went unanswered. The aircraft that had destroyed bombers over Lexington vanished into the Pacific darkness. Lieutenant Commander Phillips raised a troubling possibility immediately after landing. Had Kernan's fire accidentally hit O'Hare? The friendly fire theory haunted survivors for decades. Kernan himself suffered from the uncertainty, never knowing whether his bullets had killed his flight leader. Lundstrom's exhaustive 1997 investigation examined all available evidence and concluded that Japanese guns most likely killed O'Hare. Kernan's own eyewitness testimony, clear and consistent over the years, described seeing the Betty's tracers strike O'Hare's aircraft. The geometry of the engagement supported this conclusion. The evidence, while not absolute, favoured enemy action over friendly fire. Edward O'Hare was 29 years old. His body was never recovered despite extensive search efforts by destroyers in the task force. He is listed on the courts of the missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, alongside 18,000 other service members who gave their lives in the Pacific and whose remains were never found or identified. The pilot who saved Lexington died pioneering the tactics that would help defeat the very threat he was trying to counter. The Black Panther operations O'Hare developed did not die with him. Other pilots refined the techniques he had created. Night fighter capabilities improved steadily throughout the remainder of the war. By 1945, American carriers could defend themselves around the clock. The concepts O'Hare tested at the cost of his life became standard capabilities that protected the fleet. The legacy of February 20th lived on in ways O'Hare never witnessed. On April 19th, 1947, Colonel Robert McCormick, publisher of the Chicago Tribune and himself a World War I veteran, gave a radio address lamenting how quickly military heroes are forgotten. He proposed that Chicago's Orchard Place Airport be renamed in O'Hare's honor. The suggestion resonated with a city that remembered the war years. Although O'Hare was born in St. Louis, his father's long Chicago residence provided sufficient connection. Easy Eddie had lived and died in Chicago. His son had grown up visiting the city. The link was tenuous but adequate. In September 1949, the dedication ceremony took place. The airport that would become one of the busiest in the world now carried the name of a pilot who had saved a carrier in 4 minutes of desperate combat. The old designation, Orchard Place, survived only in the airport code ORD, which travelers still see on their boarding passes today. On March 23, 1963, President John Kennedy formally dedicated the new terminal at O'Hare International Airport. Kennedy had served in the Pacific himself, commanding PT-109, a patrol torpedo boat that was rammed and sunk by Japanese destroyer Amagiri on August 2, 1943. Kennedy had rescued his crew and swam to safety, earning the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. He understood what O'Hare had faced and what his sacrifice meant. Kennedy called the airport one of the wonders of the modern world and urged Americans to remember the young pilot for whom it was named. He laid a wreath at O'Hare's monument, handed to him by the pilot's nephews. The ceremony connected a young president to a young pilot, both of whom had served in the Pacific, one of whom had died there. The Navy honored O'Hare with a destroyer bearing his name. USS O'Hare, designated DD-889, was commissioned on November 29, 1945. His mother, Selma O'Hare, sponsored the ship at its christening. The destroyer served with distinction until October 31, 1973, when she was decommissioned and transferred to the Spanish Navy. She continued operating as Mendez Núñez until April 1992, nearly half a century after the battle that earned her namesake his fame. In Terminal 2 of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, a restored Grumman F-4F3 Wildcat hangs suspended from the ceiling. The aircraft was recovered from Lake Michigan in 1992, where it had sunk during a training accident in 1943. Restorers painted it to replicate O'Hare's Medal of Honor aircraft, designated White F-15. The original display was installed in November 1997, and a 75th anniversary rededication ceremony took place in February 2017. Travelers rushing to catch flights pass beneath the Wildcat without knowing its story. They glance at the aircraft and see an antique, a relic from a war that ended 8 decades ago. They do not see the 4 minutes that saved a carrier. They do not see the young pilot who faced impossible odds and prevailed. The story of February 20th carries lessons that extend beyond one pilot's heroism. The Japanese attack failed not merely because O'Hare was an exceptional marksman, but because Japanese commanders made assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. They assumed that range was worth any sacrifice in protection. The G-4M Betty could fly farther than any comparable aircraft, but its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it fatally vulnerable. 15 of 17 bombers were destroyed in a single afternoon. The crews who flew them died because designers had prioritized capability over survivability. They assumed that sending bombers without fighter escort was acceptable when carriers were detected. The Zero fighters at Rabaul could not reach Lexington's position. Rather than wait for proper resources, Japanese commanders sent their aircraft into a battle they could not win. They assumed that American defenses would be weak and disorganized. Instead, they encountered pilots trained by John Thach, flying aircraft maintained to exacting standards, directed by radar that gave them time to intercept. The Japanese had studied American equipment and found it inferior to their own in many categories. They had not studied American training, American organization, and American adaptability. These qualities would prove decisive not just on February 20th, but throughout the Pacific War. For the Americans, February 20th demonstrated that individual excellence mattered enormously. O'Hare's marksmanship, honed through months of intensive training, allowed him to accomplish what less skilled pilots could not have achieved. His 60 rounds per kill reflected countless hours of practice, refined technique, and natural ability that combined into lethal effectiveness. But individual excellence operated within institutional frameworks. The radar that detected the incoming bombers gave O'Hare time to intercept. The aircraft maintenance that kept his guns functioning when Dufilos jammed gave him weapons to fire. The training that Thach had imposed on VF-3 gave him the skills to use those weapons effectively. One pilot saved Lexington, but an entire system put that pilot in position to succeed. The history we remember often reduces complex individuals to single moments. Edward O'Hare becomes the pilot who saved Lexington, frozen forever at age 27, making those diving attacks through a formation of enemy bombers. The years of training, the development of tactics, the leadership of a combat squadron, the pioneering night fighter operations all fade into background detail. But those 4 minutes revealed character that took a lifetime to form. The marksmanship came from childhood with rifles and years of naval training. The courage came from somewhere deeper, perhaps from watching a father make a choice that led to his death. The skill came from a mentor who demanded excellence and a student who exceeded expectations. Every pilot in VF-3 trained for air combat. Any of them might have faced those bombers if circumstances had been different. But circumstances placed O'Hare above that formation with functioning guns and the skills to use them. What he did with that opportunity is what we remember. 8 decades have passed since O'Hare's Wildcat dove through that formation of Japanese bombers. The witnesses are gone. The ships have been scrapped or sunk. The aircraft survive only in museums and memorials. But 4 minutes of desperate courage endure in the historical record, reminding us what individual determination can accomplish when everything depends on one person's willingness to fight. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories that deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping the memory of heroes like Edward O'Hare alive.